It was just after midnight when the city of Pensacola rang in the new year of 1985. Music spilled out of crowded bars, cars moved slowly along the streets, and strangers toasted to fresh beginnings. Among those celebrating was a young mother, only 23 years old, who had chosen this rare night out as an escape from the weight of her responsibilities. Her name was Tanya McKinley. Before we dive deeper, if you love true crime stories told with every detail uncovered, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And if you're already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community. Now, let's get into tonight's case, one that sat unsolved for 35 years before DNA finally exposed the truth. She had spent the evening at Daryl's, one of the area's most popular bars. Tanya was cheerful, talking with friends, smiling at strangers, savoring the kind of carefree night she seldom allowed herself. At home, her 18-month-old son, Timothy, was waiting to be cared for by family, while she enjoyed this single evening of freedom. It was meant to be a simple celebration, nothing more, but it would instead mark the last time anyone saw her alive. Sometime after 1:30 in the morning, Tanya left the bar. Where she went next would remain a mystery for hours. Then, at 5:16 a.m., passers-by stumbled upon a scene so grim it would haunt the city for decades. Tanya's body lay on the side of Peacock Drive, 7 miles away from Daryl's. Her shoes, purse, and a bloodied towel were scattered across the road. She had been beaten. The bruises on her neck told detectives she had been strangled. Forensics worked the scene carefully. They discovered semen samples, evidence that would become crucial years later. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy. There was little they could do with it beyond preserving it for a future that might hold better technology. At the time, they relied on interviews, hunches, and the possibility of someone slipping up. Their first focus was Tanya's boyfriend, Tim Davidson. He was the father of her son, and family members immediately painted a troubling picture of him. Tanya's sister, Renee, told investigators that he had once thrown Tanya out of their home while she was still pregnant. She recalled another frightening incident when he allegedly tried to run Tanya over with a car during an argument. His temper, his control, his history with Tanya, all of it suggested motive. Police leaned in on this lead. Davidson was questioned and scrutinized, but when his DNA was compared against the crime scene evidence, it didn't match. He was ruled out. The investigation turned to the bar. Daryl's had been alive with energy on New Year's Eve, full of faces that blurred together after drinks and dancing. Detectives tracked down witnesses, many of whom remembered Tanya but could not say who she left with or what exactly happened after she walked out. No one could provide solid information. Slowly, the investigation began to stall. As weeks turned into months, Tanya's case shifted into the cold category. Leads dried up, tips slowed, and with their main suspect eliminated, investigators had little left to hold on to. Her story appeared periodically in the media, especially around anniversaries of her death. Local stations like Where TV revisited the case, reminding the public that the young mother's killer was still free. But beyond those reminders, there was little progress. The years passed relentlessly. Tanya's son grew up without her, asking questions his family could not answer. Detectives retired, new ones came in, and the case file was passed along like a burden no one could lift. A decade slipped by, then another still. For many, it felt like this crime would remain one of Pensacola's darkest unsolved tragedies. But the world had changed. By 2020, forensic science had transformed the landscape of investigations. Genetic genealogy, a field unimagined back in 1985, had become a powerful tool for solving long, cold cases. Through publicly available DNA databases, detectives could now take crime scene DNA, build expansive family trees, and trace a suspect through distant relatives who had submitted their genetic information for ancestry searches. When Tanya's preserved evidence was finally run through these new systems, results began to form. Connections appeared. Distant cousins, extended family, branches on a tree that pointed toward one line. Piece by piece, the tree was constructed. And in the end, one name emerged: Daniel Leonard Wells. To most, Wells seemed like an ordinary man. By 2020, he was 57 years old, a Pensacola resident with no criminal record, no history of violence, and no reason for anyone to suspect him. He had lived his life quietly. If he had secrets, he kept them buried deep. But the DNA evidence told another story. Investigators couldn't rush. They needed to be absolutely certain. For days, they shadowed Wells. They followed his vehicle, monitored his movements, and waited for the opportunity to collect something, anything that could connect him undeniably to the crime scene. That opportunity came on March 4, 2020. Wells was on his commute when he flicked a cigarette butt out of his car window. Behind him, a surveillance team quickly retrieved it. The sample was tested against the DNA from Tanya's case. The match was perfect. The odds of it belonging to anyone else were impossible. 1 in 700 billion. 35 years after Tanya's death, detectives had finally found the man responsible. Now they needed to bring him in. On March 18, 2020, officers staged a traffic stop. Wells had no idea what was coming. Officer Hart approached calmly, asking for his license. Wells handed it over without suspicion. What he didn't know was that the entire department had been tracking him, preparing for this very moment. Within minutes, he was told he would need to come with them. The man who had lived freely for decades, believing his secret would never surface, was now on his way to an interrogation room. For investigators, this was where the case would finally turn. They had the evidence, but now they needed the story. They needed him to explain, to admit, to reveal what had happened on that cold January morning in 1985. Wells, however, had spent 35 years convincing himself the truth would never matter. He didn't yet realize that science had already spoken for him. The confession. Inside the sterile walls of the interrogation room, Daniel Wells sat across from detectives who had been preparing for this moment for months. To him, it must have felt like an ordinary traffic stop that spiraled into something confusing. To them, it was the culmination of 35 years of waiting. The questioning began calmly. Detectives asked if he remembered New Year's Eve in 1985. Did he know a young woman named Tanya McKinley? Did the name spark any memory at all? Wells shook his head. He said he didn't know her. He denied any connection. When pressed, he tried to make light of the fact that decades had passed. He couldn't recall a night from so long ago, he said. But detectives weren't relying on his memory. They already had his DNA. They knew he was lying. They asked him about where he lived at the time. Did he remember an address on Elmrest Drive? The question wasn't random. That house was in close proximity to where Tanya's body had been discovered. But again, Wells claimed he didn't remember. He seemed eager to create distance between himself and every detail they presented. The detectives continued patiently, shifting the conversation. They asked him about his younger years. Where did he hang out? Did he go to bars? Did he ever pick up women? Wells admitted he sometimes had one-night stands, that he drank and partied. But when asked directly about Daryl's, the very bar where Tanya had spent her last hours, he acted as if the name didn't ring a bell. It struck investigators as strange. He could name other bars, even recall certain places where he partied, but Daryl's, the one that mattered most, he conveniently couldn't remember. As the interview went on, the detectives changed tactics. They leaned in closer, pressing harder. They told him they had evidence. They told him the science was clear. They had his DNA from the scene. One of them looked him in the eyes and said, "There's a 1 in 700 billion chance it's not you." Wells's confidence began to waver. He fidgeted in his chair, shifted his answers. Still, he resisted. He tried to argue that DNA could only prove he had been with her, not that he had harmed her. But the detectives weren't done. They reminded him that 35 years had passed, that he had lived free while a family lived with unanswered grief. They spoke about Tanya's son, who grew up without his mother, never knowing who had taken her away. They appealed to Wells as a father, pointing out that his own son would one day see the evidence and know what he had done. The room grew heavy with silence. Then, slowly, Wells's wall of denial began to crack. He admitted he had been with Tanya. He said they had been together at his house, that they had sex that night. At first, he insisted it was consensual. He claimed there were others around, friends who had dropped by briefly, names he tossed out as if to scatter suspicion. He tried to paint a picture of a casual evening that had ended without incident. But detectives didn't let go. They pressed for details. What happened after those friends left? What happened when Tanya wanted to go home? Why did her body end up discarded on the side of a road? That's when Wells's story shifted again. He admitted there had been an argument. He said Tanya wanted to leave, but he didn't want her to. He claimed he struck her with a wooden cutting board in his kitchen. The blow knocked her unconscious. He described panicking, not knowing what to do. He said he checked for a pulse, that she wasn't responding. In his own words, he admitted to strangling her. At one point, he even acknowledged trying to have sex with her again, after she was already incapacitated. His words painted a chilling picture. Detectives knew what they were hearing. A confession that matched the brutality of the crime scene they had studied for decades. Wells tried to soften it. framing it as something that escalated in the heat of the moment, an argument that went too far. But the details he gave, the blow to the head, the strangulation, the second attempt at intimacy, revealed a darker truth. Afterward, he admitted, he placed Tanya's body in his truck and drove to Peacock Drive. He left her there, discarded like trash. He went home, carried on with his life, and for 35 years, never faced consequences. The detectives sat with his words, letting them sink in. They had heard hundreds of confessions in their careers, but this one carried the weight of decades of waiting. The DNA had been their weapon, the science that left no room for denial. But in the end, it was Wells's own mouth that sealed his fate. When the interview concluded, the case that had haunted Pensacola for 35 years was no longer unsolved. They had their man. They had his confession, and they had the science to back it up. Detectives then made the call they had dreamed of making for decades. They contacted Tanya's son, Timothy, now a grown man. The words were simple but life-altering. "We've made an arrest in your mother's case." On the other end of the line, Timothy was overwhelmed. For so long he had carried the silence, wondering, imagining, aching for an answer that never came. Now he finally knew who had taken his mother. The relief was tangled with sorrow. Justice had come, but nothing could bring her back. Daniel Wells was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. In the headlines, Tanya's name returned, no longer just a reminder of tragedy, but as the center of a case that had finally been solved. Yet the story didn't end with the arrest. Just weeks after being taken into custody, before he could face trial, Wells was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. For Tanya's family, it was another bitter twist. They had waited 35 years for justice, and now the man responsible had escaped the courtroom. Still, in his death, the truth remained. His DNA, his confession, his own words. They ensured that Tanya's story would no longer be an unsolved mystery. She had a name for her killer. Her family had an answer. And Pensacola finally had closure for one of its darkest crimes. The decades of silence and the price of justice. For Tanya's family, the arrest of Daniel Wells in 2020 was a moment of long-awaited truth, but it came wrapped in layers of pain that had stretched across generations. For 35 years, they had lived in a shadow of unanswered questions. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays passed without Tanya. Every gathering carried the emptiness of her absence. And for her son Timothy, the absence was far more than emotional. It was foundational. Timothy was only 18 months old when Tanya was killed. Too young to remember her face, her voice, or the way she laughed. He grew up with fragments of her, photographs tucked into family albums, stories told by relatives, a vague sense of who she had been. But none of it could replace a mother's presence. The loss was silent but constant, shaping his childhood in ways that words could never fully capture. He grew into adulthood knowing only that his mother's life had been stolen violently, and that the person responsible had never been found. Every time he looked at his reflection, he carried the thought of her. Every milestone, graduations, first jobs, birthdays, came with a question that could never be answered. What would my mother have thought if she were here? Tanya's family had tried to fill the void with love and care, but they too bore the scars of her loss. Her sister Renee became one of the loudest voices keeping Tanya's name alive in the years after her death. She spoke to media outlets. She pressed investigators. She refused to let the case fade entirely into obscurity. Even as leads dried up, she believed there had to be an answer somewhere, somehow. That persistence was not in vain. By the late 2010s, cold cases across the country were being revisited with new eyes. The rise of forensic genealogy had already led to arrests in cases that had gone unsolved for decades. The most famous was the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer whose DNA was linked to a string of assaults and killings in California. His arrest in 2018 had shown the world, and law enforcement, that genealogy could crack doors once thought permanently closed. Tanya's case followed that path. Investigators entered the preserved DNA sample into genealogy databases, building a tree of relatives. Piece by piece, the branches were traced until Daniel Wells's name emerged. It was a moment of revelation that connected 35 years of silence with a face no one had suspected. For those who knew Wells, the news came as a shock. He had no criminal history. He was not known for violence. To neighbors, he was simply an ordinary man. But the DNA, the cigarette butt, the confession, all of it revealed the truth. Beneath the quiet life he built, there was a secret he had buried so deeply that even those closest to him never saw it. For Pensacola police, Tanya's case was more than just a cold file solved. It became a symbol of perseverance, of the importance of never discarding evidence, and of the belief that no matter how much time passes, science may eventually uncover the truth. Detectives who had long since retired saw in Tanya's case the realization of what they had hoped for: closure, even if it came decades late. But closure in true crime is rarely simple. When Timothy learned of the arrest, his emotions collided: relief, anger, gratitude, sorrow. For so long, he had imagined his mother's final moments without knowing the truth. Now he knew. He knew that she had been hurt, that she had fought, that she had been left on the roadside by a man who lived his life freely for 35 years. And then, just as quickly as Wells was named a suspect, as he was charged and prepared to face trial, he was gone. His death in his cell in 2020 felt like another theft. Tanya's family would never see him stand before a judge. They would never hear a jury speak the word guilty. They would never look him in the eye as he was sentenced. It was bittersweet justice. The truth had come, but the trial had vanished. Still, Timothy expressed gratitude to investigators. He thanked them for never giving up, for using every resource available to find the truth about his mother. And though his pain would never disappear, he finally had an answer he could carry with him. The case also drew attention from across the nation, as another example of the power of genealogy. In interviews, detectives emphasized how careful preservation of evidence had made the breakthrough possible. Without the semen sample from 1985, stored safely for decades, Tanya's case might have remained unsolved forever. Experts in forensic science pointed out that Tanya's story was not unique. Thousands of cold cases still sit in evidence lockers across the United States, waiting for technology, waiting for one more chance to speak. With genealogy tools, many of those cases may one day find the same ending Tanya's did. For the city of Pensacola, Tanya's case became a reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, is still justice. The name that once lived in silence, whispered only by grieving family and frustrated detectives, was now written clearly in history: Daniel Leonard Wells. He could no longer hide, yet beyond the headlines and the technology, Tanya's story remains personal. She was more than a case file, more than a tragic victim. She was a young mother who wanted nothing more than to raise her child, to laugh with her friends, to live a life filled with ordinary joy. Her story is one of loss, but also of the relentless pursuit of truth, of detectives who refused to give up, and of a family who carried her memory for decades until justice arrived. And while Wells's death in custody meant he would never serve time, the confession he gave, the science that tied him to her, ensured that his name would forever be marked by the crime he committed. He had believed he escaped. For 35 years he lived with the silence, but in the end, the truth found him. The enduring truth, the news of Daniel Wells's arrest and subsequent death, made headlines far beyond Pensacola. It was not just another crime story. It became part of a growing conversation about how science was rewriting the possibilities of justice. Across the country, families who had endured decades of silence began asking whether their loved one's case might be next. For investigators, Tanya's case was validation of years spent fighting for advances in forensic tools. What had once been thought impossible, solving crimes 3 decades old, was now within reach. Cold case units everywhere began re-examining evidence, scouring storage lockers, and reopening files that had long been dormant. If Tanya's case could be solved after 35 years, what else might be uncovered? The story also became a cautionary tale for offenders who believed time was on their side. Wells had lived quietly, blending into his community, never raising suspicion. He had no criminal record, no reputation for violence, nothing that would have placed him on police radar. And yet the DNA never lied. No matter how many years passed, the science remained unshakable. For Timothy, Tanya's son, the revelation closed one door but opened another. He now had the truth, but he also had to live with the knowledge of how brutally his mother's life was taken. There were moments when he expressed gratitude for the closure, for knowing the name and the face of the man responsible. But there were also moments of sorrow, when he admitted that no answer could ever truly heal the absence left behind. The same could be said for Tanya's family. They had fought for decades to keep her memory alive, to push for justice, and in the end they had achieved it. But it was a victory tinged with grief. They would never see Wells stand trial. They would never watch justice unfold in a courtroom. Instead, it ended in a jail cell, with him taking his own life. Still, his confession ensured that there would be no doubt. He had spoken the words himself. He had described the blow, the strangulation, the panic, and the dumping of Tanya's body. He had admitted what he had done, That truth, paired with the DNA match, removed any shadow of uncertainty. For law enforcement, Tanya's case became a rallying point for the importance of preserving evidence. Had the samples not been carefully stored for decades, the truth might never have been revealed. Detectives urged other departments to revisit their old cases, to test samples again with the new technology, to never assume that time alone could close a file. The impact was felt across the nation. Dozens of cold cases were solved in the years following Tanya's, each one a reminder that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Families long trapped in silence finally heard the names of those responsible. Communities found answers, and offenders who had lived freely for decades discovered that the past could still catch up with them. But for Pensacola, the story always circled back to Tanya herself. She was remembered not only as the victim of a brutal crime, but as a young woman who deserved to live her life fully. Friends described her as kind, fun-loving, and devoted to her little boy. Those who knew her said she was the type of person who could light up a room with her presence. She was not just a statistic, not just another unsolved case number. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend. In the end, her story became one of both tragedy and resilience. The tragedy of a life cut short. The resilience of a family that refused to let her memory fade. The resilience of detectives who kept the file open, who never gave up, who carried her name across decades until they could finally say the words that mattered most. We found him. And in that moment, Tanya's story became more than a local case. It became a symbol of the persistence of truth. It showed that no matter how carefully a secret is buried, no matter how many years pass, science and determination can unearth it. Daniel Wells may have believed he had escaped. For 35 years, he lived without answering for what he had done. But justice has a way of catching up, slowly, silently, until the day it can no longer be ignored. For Tanya McKinley, that day finally came in 2020. And though she did not live to see it, and though her family endured decades of silence, her story stands as proof that the truth has a way of enduring. It waited in a single preserved sample, hidden away in storage, until the world was ready to listen. It spoke for her. It brought her voice back, and it ensured that the man who silenced her could never hide again. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who follows true crime as closely as you do. And let me know in the comments, do you believe forensic genealogy will eventually solve every cold case? Or are there some secrets that will remain buried forever? Your thoughts matter, and I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, justice may take time, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.